Hello, Dylan.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dylan.
Where are we
Nice to
speaking
see
to you from? Where are you speaking to us from?
Well, I can't tell you that. I'm in a secret location.
It looks like a holiday resort.
Does that?
Westward Ho.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
You're in your undersea volcano, aren't you?
Exactly. It's Stingray. Exactly. Yeah.
It's great to see you. But I think you should be a regular on this show because you are, cultural commentator. Can I just open the bidding by saying I just devoured the book this weekend, read the whole thing.
You.
It's brilliant. It's so great, and it's so interesting to see that year framed like that. We should probably point out that it is about the year 1975.
It is indeed. May I ask you a question?
May you ask what?
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
Is it okay if I have my dog's making a terrible noise and he wants to be picked up? So here he is. Is that allowed? Am I allowed to have a
What's his name?
He's called Louis. He's a multi-poo.
If he's registered as an emotional support animal, then yes.
You're a little quiet for me, Dylan. Is Ben? Can I just mention that?
Okay. Do you want me to turn this up?
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Dylan, how I think what Guy is reaching for as well. Oh, is how did you just suddenly decide 75 needed some PR?
Look, I was as much of an advocate and a fan of punk as anyone else. And I loved it and I devoured it and I went to all those gigs and I went to all those venues, etc., etc. However, when I was in the Ralph West Halls of Residence in 1977 and having been to the Roxy or the Red Cow or the 100 Club or wherever, I would go back to my room and I would play those records that I suddenly wasn't allowed to like anymore. And one of the things I always had a problem with during punk was this kind of year zero thing. And I understand that there needed to be a line drawn in the sand, and it needed the energy to dismiss the previous generation. I was 15 years old in 1970. And not only was I enjoying a lot of the music at the time, but also I was enjoying, because I was a curious person, I was enjoying that sense of discovery, of finding out all of this stuff that I hadn't heard before. So as much as I loved punk and totally embraced it, I wasn't about to relinquish my past.
I'd like to come in here with a point which is a yes and a no to that, because 1975 is an incredibly important year for me, because that was the year that music became everything. Right, that's the year I discovered The Who, and by the end of that year, I've got my first bass guitar. So it means everything. Yeah. And you're absolutely right about all those important records. But what is important, I think, for why punk had to happen for someone like me coming to music then, is all those records, and especially the records that you point out, which are so amazing, are so far removed. They're so far removed from anything I could be a part of or engage with. The closest things are Bruce Springsteen. And maybe Brian Ferry, but again, he's Jerry Hall cover of Vogue by this point. Bowie is in Philadelphia. It's all so elsewhere.
But if you the great thing about all these records is they're novelistic. They are produced at a level that is completely beyond all of us. And I didn't think that was worth denigrating. I mean, you take something like The Hissing of Summer Lawns. It's probably the most sophisticated record that's ever been made. You take something like Blood on the Tracks, which is Bob Dylan's divorce album. I mean, that was really the first Bob Dylan album that I was old enough to understand. I didn't like all the 60s stuff. It was beyond me. And I loved that.
Or the Paul Simon album of the time.
Yeah, I mean, they were incredibly powerful records.
But here's the point. They're full grown-ups, aren't they? This is the thing. They're very grown-up subjects, and they're very grown-up.
When you're 14 or 15, you want to be older than you are. And actually, the weird thing is, I was looking at pictures of myself from that period. Now, I look older in 1975 than I did 2 years later.
But I mean, part of it was a generation gap. That it was another generation. We were late boomers. Or as we read a few weeks ago, Generation Jones, as we were called.
Yeah,
slightly disappointed.
Yeah, I'm not having boomer. I'm not having it. I'm not having it.
But there was the boomers in 75 were looking back on their youth they were reassessing their careers.
Yeah.
They were post Altamont. We can talk about all of this later. And our age group, 15, 16, wanted something of their own. And I think it was a generational revolution.
We got it. We very much got it. Plus, at that time, I think the journey had already started. I mean, I saw probably my formative gig was going to see Dr. Feelgood in the Nag's Head in High Wycombe, where I saw all my gigs. And I always, up until very recently, I thought this was in early 75. It wasn't. It was in November 74. For me, so it all started then. It was watching Wilko Johnson in a room that's smaller than my kitchen. It was amazing. And then, of course, you have something like Horses. Now, there's a book out at the moment that you've obviously heard of. Maybe you've even read the Keith McNally book.
Yeah.
The great
Restaurateur,
who tore up New York for 4 decades. And he's often called the man who invented downtown. But actually, I think Patti Smith was the person who invented downtown. Because if you look at the cover of Horses, that amazing Mapplethorpe picture of Patti Smith in 1975, women didn't look like that in 1975. No one looked like that in 1975. And even going into punk, not only was that one of the records that you were still allowed to like, but it was still an incredibly transgressive image. It was a transgressive record because you had R&B from them and Van Morrison mixed in with avant-garde poetry and this allure of the downtown scene in New York, which was already a couple of years ahead of what was about to happen in London. So I thought that was, again, a fascinating artifact.
Also, that sound, isn't it? Because that sound is behind. It's what's going to be television. It's what's going to be, all those bands.
I mean, you're right. You're completely right. Because that record, which was made in 75, started recording in 74. Sounds like a lot of records that came out in 78.
Yeah.
Immediate post-punk period.
So in your book, you're not just saying here are artists who are in their mature years, who are discovering adult-orientated rock, who are looking back. There are also, we're on the cusp here, that 75 is also, there are acts that are about to create what's coming next.
Yes, that is totally true, Gary. But also, I think that I was trying to point out the incredible variety of stuff that was going on at the time, because you had formative craft work, you have Noy, you have Brian Eno in ambient, you have what Smokey Robinson is doing, you have Millie Jackson, you have all these extraordinary records. And the thing is, this isn't, all the stuff that I'm talking about. I was aware of a lot of that, but I wasn't aware of all of it. And I think it's only with hindsight that year becomes of incredible importance. And also, for a while, you wouldn't have been allowed to do this because you would have been vilified. You would have been crucified for celebrating 1975 because it was before the great groundswell, the great change of punk, which, as we know, was much needed.
Yeah, but by the way, because it's been great listening to all of it, but I still think a lot of that stuff is actually transitional. Like you write fantastically about Katie Lyde, the Steely Dan. And this is where Steely Dan have kind of decided to be Steely Dan as we know it, right? They've just decided it's about the studio. They're not going to tour anymore, and it's all very arch and very sardonic. But to me, that's the album of theirs I probably listen to the least because they're not there yet. Do you know what I mean? They've just started the journey towards what's going to be Asia, whatever.
I think that's completely right. I think that that idea of a lot of these records being transitional records is true, actually, because a lot of those people went on to do other things. However, I mean, you take Steely Dan. Steely Dan, for me, were always a private passion. No one at school liked Steely Dan. None of my mates liked Steely Dan. And when in 76, 77, certainly whenever I said Steely Dan, people looked at me like I was a mad hippie, even though I didn't look like one. So Steely Dan always irritated people, but that's fine. I can cope with that. But then you take someone like Joni Mitchell, who I think you're right saying was in transition. But after Hissing of Summer Lawn, she started making records like Hijira, and things got a bit jazzier, a bit complicated, a bit too arch and a bit too difficult. So actually, a lot of these people wandered off into areas that were not so interesting.
Well, I think that's the same with Steely Dan. I think I'd slightly disagree with Guy, and I think that I really like that earlier period. And
I love that. I
think
completely love that. I'm saying, is this what I don't like? I love both of them. This is neither fish nor fowl to me.
There's something more self-referential when they get a little bit later on, and they know who they are, and they know how polished they have to be, and they got to get the right session players in. They still feel like a band at this point, but lyrically, it's the maturity of lyrics that I think this book looks at the most, and a certain level of, yes, they are sort of no longer part of the street. You know, they're not in Laurel Canyon now so much as in Beverly Hills, and there's that slightly wistful feeling for the past that 75 offers. And there's a really interesting quote, I think, in the end of your book, where I think Jimmy Page is talking to William Burroughs. Is that right? And he says that people don't somehow respect, something like they don't respect. It's dangerous to be an old rocker now, you know, that people are anti us. And is it that, because there is a good and bad in this. There's yes, these people are out of touch with reality, but also they were older than anyone had ever been in music, and deserved to write as an adult.
Yeah, that is certainly true, and that's the point you quite right. I'm making the book, but the other interesting thing is that we thought they were dinosaurs. I mean, they were barely in their early 30s, you know. They were like 30, 32, 33, and these people who'd had this extraordinary life were still relatively young men. However, I do have a terrible admission to make, is that at the time, I just didn't like Led Zeppelin. I didn't like Led Zeppelin for decades. I didn't like them when I was a kid. For me, it was those guys at school who wore great coats, who carried around Led Zepp 2 under their arm. I hated all that stuff. And it wasn't...
I'm with you. I wasn't a Led Zeppelin person either.
And it wasn't until I became older and perhaps more sophisticated and less strident that I appreciated what an extraordinary beast they were.
To be honest, it was this album that did it for me. I remember seeing when the Old Grey Whistle Test used to do those videos they make where they show old cartoons, and they had one of those for Trampled Underfoot. And it was like, what the fuck? And that was actually the thing that turned me on to Led Zeppelin. So Physical Graffiti was actually the first Led Zeppelin album I bought. There's all right, if we're going to talk about dinosaurs, can we have a quick word on, because I love to finally read something somewhere about The Who by numbers.
Oh, what a great record. Come on.
Yeah, I mean,
we all love Pete, 80 years old. Everything he's done always has such an air of curiosity about it. And that was a great record. The thing about The Who is, we all cherry pick their greatest hits and we love the concerts, but I think there were very few albums that were perfectly formed. I'm very much looking forward to the ballet on Quadrophenia. Mm-hmm. For me, Quadrophenia is a better album than Tommy. Tommy was too young for me. It was kind of 60s. But again, you're right about this whole thing of transition, because even Quadrophenia had an air of wistfulness for the past, because it was celebrating something that happened 8 or 9 years previously. I interviewed Pete a couple of times last year for various projects, and he told me something really interesting that I'd never heard before. And we were talking about the movie of Quadrophenia and the face, the idea of the face. He said, the thing is, the faces never were on two wheels. They were never on scooters. They were never on bikes. They were always in transit vans. That's because the faces were the dealers and the transit vans were full of drugs. Never heard that before. I love that.
That's so Pete.
But there is a sense that in 75, people are all being drawn to the autobiographical within their lyrics.
Completely. Yeah. And I think that's one of the themes of the book, is that they were being very novelistic, because if you look at the almost solipsistic writing of the time, when you've got people like John Updike writing that there is it's the interior world that's being that's being examined. And actually, it's the world that Tom Wolfe railed against. And I was a huge fan of Tom Wolfe at the time because he was writing in a novelistic way about real things, because it was non-fiction, and non-fiction has always been more attractive to me. But that's certainly true. And even you got things like Siren and Young Americans. Again, there is, even though they're embracing the dance floor for the first time, there is a wistfulness about those records.
We'll get onto those, I think, in more detail. But it's odd as well that they're probably, I can think of two immediately that are about divorces. You know, Still Crazy After All These Years, Paul Simon, and Blood on the Tracks. Yeah. It's kind of, when you say that, it's no wonder 76 happened.
Yeah, well,
this was happening to 30-somethings, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I'm like,
but for us, is this about our parents? Do you know what I mean? Is that what it's meant to be?
This is like reading books, because I'm 14, 15, and you're reading or you're listening to this stuff, and Blood on the Tracks to me is full of all this trauma that I don't understand. I mean, I was still kissing girls in discos. And they're writing about having a relationship which was so complex and was collapsing, and all of that was fascinating to a curious teenager.
Also, can we just say, musically, it was so head and shoulders above anything Dylan had done for years.
Absolutely,
so,
yeah. Well, I suppose there must have been an element of technical about it too, that by 75 there was the ability to make posh recordings. I'm wondering if the growth of the studio was also something to do with this. But one of the things the book seems to land on is the way that the center of gravity has shifted much more to America, and to, primarily to the West Coast of America. That 75 is about being excited by the limousine, being excited by cocaine, and a lifestyle that rock had created, the private jets, etc.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that, yes, there did need to be a correction. But as we all know, it doesn't take more than 15 minutes to start enjoying that lifestyle. Regardless of when you become famous. And I think it was also the first time that, because in the 60s, if you examined all of that stuff, the idea of sophistication and growing up was sitting in a field. And I had no interest in that. That was literally of no interest to me. I hated all that. I went to the Reading Festival once, and it was one of the worst experiences of my life. And actually, at that age, and if you don't perhaps come from if you come from a particular background, the idea of being on a private jet and wandering around the West Coast in a big fancy car is actually quite exciting.
But and something you touched on in the book as well, which is it's kind of the LA of the 70s it's like the Riviera of the 20s, isn't it? It's viewed in that same way. It's sort of Fitzgeraldian.
And I hope that and I hope that I've written about that in slightly sardonic terms, because it was something that was a fantasy, and that fantasy quite rightly becomes fractured after punk. But at the time, I think you're right. It was fated because it seemed to be like an end game, like you'd made it. It was you had the private jet and the split level modernist Beverly Hills Bel Air mansion.
Yeah, but I think it's actually on point in that we've got the studio program running at the moment on Apple or wherever it's on, which is set now, but all the look of it is very much browns and beiges and the LA of the 70s that we look back on. But I think it's part of what makes 75 so exciting. It's before anybody criticized anything.
Yeah.
It's before the downfall, isn't it? It's absolutely rock and roll in its pomp.
But I think if I was a keen consumer of the New Musical Express from the age of 12, I remember changing from Pop Swap, which was kind of like a smash hits at the time, to the NME, because I'd seen a Nick Kent review of an Alice Cooper album, and I loved Alice Cooper, and he was writing about it in a way which was it kind of confused me, because he obviously liked it, but he's been quite nasty about it at the same time, and I thought that was quite cool. So even from that age, 12, 13, when I started buying the NME, you were reading about these things that you didn't really know about, and also there was a latent kind of underbelly of cynicism about the world that I'm describing. And if you read Nick Kent and Charles Shaar Murray, and then obviously Tony and Julie, and when the new stream came in, there was always a kind of scratching away at this lifestyle that had been kind of suffused with rock music. But I think if you look back at the NME in 72, 73, 74, it was a quite snide publication, which is why I liked it. I didn't like Melody Maker, because Melody Maker was all about musicianship and stuff I had no interest in.
Folkies. It was full of folkies.
And I think that the NME was, for me, it was my Bible, because it had a caustic eye. And even though at the time I thought I was kind of one of the privileged few, I later found out it was read by 250,000 people every week.
But there's also a good point with this, which I think is that in 75, with all these various artists, is that the things before punk, you could be something and you could represent something and you could have a whole sort of politics, whatever, or ethos or philosophy, but you didn't have to say what it was. You just were that. It was after punk, you kind of had to say what you were and what you stood for.
Was kind of brilliant in one respect. And then almost immediately it started fracturing, because obviously everyone had their own personal ideologies, as well as the cultural ideology, which everyone had bought into, because it was smashing the system, because it was a reaction, which was fantastic.
I think talking about the NME is one of the things that, because I was an NME person as well, and but of course, but one of the things that irritated me later about the NME was its hatred towards soul music, black music, disco.
Except Danny Baker. He was the one
Danny
person
Baker I see as being slightly later, though, isn't he?
No, it's true. It's true.
I mean, he was still a receptionist.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so come
on. But
calm down. Security.
But and I think one of the reasons that 75 was hated was because white middle class writers hated disco. They hated anything that was about good looking kids just being, the center of attraction, dancing to what they saw as consumer music. And I think one of the good things about in this book is you focus on actually some great moments in black music.
I think
that Earth, Wind and Fire. Sorry. Stop to anyone listening. Oh my God! So I had that Earth, Wind and Fire album on this morning. Oh my God! I'd forgotten how amazing it is.
They were incredible. But I think you're so right, because there were a couple of experts at the NME, but by and large, black music was marginalised, and I hope I make a very strong case for the fact that, black music wasn't written about with the sophistication or the curiosity in the white music press in the UK at the time. Of course it wasn't. But God, there were some amazing records. And a lot of the albums came to me later. But at that time, I was still quite schizophrenic, because I was still a big consumer of soul singles. There was such what a difference a day made. That record is probably my favorite single record of that year. And so there was a duality about still going out on a Friday night, and yet having a kind of a separate life over here where you were exploring the album world, But at that time, you're right, they were very, very different.
But then you've also got Donna Summer, which is the past, which is soul, but also the future.
Also Kraftwerk,
Exactly.
But there's an interesting point, because I remember even from after punk there being this, you were saying that also with soul music, it's like there was a cut-off point, because Motown was super cool. Motown was never not super cool. But then it was like, so it's like soul music up till 1971, and then and then it sort of became something else. That's
Well,
what seems to be the division.
Motown was cool and it wasn't cool, because if you look at the way that those records and that culture was perceived by the music press in the UK, it was through the lens of kind of social realism, and it was Marvin Gaye and it was Curtis Mayfield, and I write about those records in the book.
Yes,
but
you did brilliantly.
they had a legitimacy about them, whereas if you were just making party records, which lots of people did, you were somehow frowned upon, which obviously was dim.
But the point being, all I mean is like all the weighty rock bands who are so lauded and loved, that they're all coming from a Motown past. Do you know what I mean? That's so much of what their musical DNA is. Anyway, I don't know. It's
an interesting story.
I think a lot of people were ditching that, and I think that if you look at the kind of narrative arc of the Beatles, Stones, The Who, the Kinks, in many respects, they were trying to get rid of their R&B roots.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, but then you have some girls, Rolling Stones, Miss You, and
But they all come back to it.
This goes a game changer, isn't it?
Yeah.
But of course, and that's what is exciting about the Roxy music album, Siren, because now you've got Roxy dipping their toes into disco as well, haven't you? And making one of the great dance records, of all time.
I think that. I would say this, but I think my kind of the low star for me was always Roxy and Bowie when I was that age, regardless of what else was going on. But I do think it's interesting that this year was the year they both decided to fully embrace disco and do it in such a sophisticated way. I mean, two things. I think the first thing is that I remember having this discussion with Bob Elms once, is that there's people like to wang on about what's best, the first or the second Roxy album. For me, it's always what's best, the third or the fourth one, because they were the better records. They were less art school. They had flowered into such an incredible kind of world of after dark, sexy, unobtainable kind of subculture, I suppose. But equally, I think their fifth album, I think Siren, is a masterpiece.
Oh,
a lot of people like to say they were kind of tailing off, but they weren't. And then Young Americans, even at the time, I think Bowie was more insecure about that record at the time than he was in hindsight. He was very bullish about it in hindsight because he understood what it meant to people. But even he at the time had to contextualize it by saying it was his fake soul album.
Yeah, Plastic Soul.
And not only was it not a fake soul album, it was an amazing soul album, but it's the best record I think he ever made.
Oh, Mike, funny enough, because my favourite, it took me a while to get to that from Diamond Dogs, because I was so deep into Diamond Dogs. And actually, for a long time, pretty much my favourite song on Diamond Dogs was 1984, which is practically Shaft.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is. I always had because I adore Young Americans, the track, but I had a little issue with the album. I remember growing up in that I found it really badly produced compared to, but that's probably all of the cocaine. Yes, his vocals. I always find his vocals so far away and so distant. It was almost, it didn't really want to be as upfront as before.
Maybe that's the soul thing. Maybe he felt inadequate. Well, do you know what I mean?
Because Marvin's vocals are quite low.
I think they were just. I take issue with that because I think there's a.
I can tell by your face.
It's a good job.
He's gone.
There's a sophistication. There's a softness. There's a sensuousness about his vocals, which I think are amazing. The only thing I don't like on the album is Across the Universe, because I think he just did that as a sop to Lennon.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, it kind of ruins it.
Which I found out from the book, by the way. I didn't realise that it was because Lennon had played it in the studio. So thank you for that.
I mean, it's a terrible song when the Beatles did it, and it's a terrible song when Bowie did it. And it's but that notwithstanding, I still think that Young Americans is the album.
But you're right. But there, in terms of production, Gary, we had Andy Newmark on the other week. Yeah, and he was saying, like, for instance, that drum fill in Young Americans, which all took him by surprise, is the most out of time thing he's ever played in his life. That's why they had to cover it in so much reverb and delay and everything. I also think, and it also has that guitar intro, which is the most out of tune guitar ever recorded. How that got past, but I mean, the amount of coke people must be doing. No, that's all right.
Happy accidents, guy. Happy accidents.
Yeah, exactly.
Was it tricky joining threads or finding the thread that somehow put them all in the same time zone?
No,
because there's the postmodern of Roxy and even to a certain extent of the Bowie record, and then there's the forward thinking of Horses, and then there's the sort of the grown up attitude of Paul Simon.
The short answer is no, because I didn't want to make the thread would have basically determined that this is the best year in the history of recorded music. And I don't think that. I think it's been undervalued, and I think it should be celebrated, and it was an extraordinary year. And the point I'm making is the fact that it was so varied, because you had so much going on. And actually, if you look at what went on in 75 in a different way, you can say a similar thing about 1978, which is obviously the first flowering of post-punk, and you've got people going off in all these incredible directions, having gone back to nothing. So there wasn't a thread. It was just the fact that I think my point was that a lot of this great stuff had fallen through the cracks at the end of one generation, at the start of another.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Can we get on to, sorry, one little thing, a mind-blowing fact that I've discovered from your book, which is to do with the early Saturday Night Live.
Which is what?
Which is two guys sitting watching it in the Dakota.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know that story, Gary?
Wouldn't have that?
No, I know.
They actually made a very bad film. They made a very bad film about the fact that John Lennon and Paul McCartney are watching Saturday Night Live in its formative weeks. I mean, I think it was late 75, where whoever was presenting at the time said, here's like a joke, here's like 300 quid or 1,000 quid if you're watching this, boys, come down.
It was Lorne Michaels. I think, wasn't it Lorne Michaels? He said, yeah, I've spoken to the network. I've got $2,000 for the Beatles to reform.
Yeah. And Paul McCartney is in the Dakota with John Lennon watching it on television. And they think, shall we? Come on, shall we? But they didn't. And someone did make a not very good film about that sort of 3-hour period.
But again, this is another thing, that just feeds into how our whole narrative of John and Paul has been shot to pieces, from starting with, with Get Back, Let It Be. The whole thing of how the idea that they were even sitting around watching TV together in the 70s. It's really interesting.
That was the narrative. I mean, God, when Get Back came out, I played it. My wife thought I was mad. She thought I was deranged. I played every episode. I watched the entire thing three times.
Same here, 3 times.
Yeah.
And the thing I said to my mate David Rosen, who's probably more of a Beatles nut than I am, the fact is that you start off with Lennon, obviously out of his mind on Smack, and by the end of it on the rooftop, it's his band again. He's in charge. He's right at the front, and it's all about him. It was just extraordinary, the whole thing. Sorry.
One of the things that I don't know that comes across in the book is this awareness of failure that a lot of the artists have, and I think that is part of the era, that there's a cynicism about, the revolution never worked. After Altamont in '69, there was these Vietnamese kids that had protested so heartily and thought they were going to create a new kind of culture, these counterculturalists. It never came to pass, and politically Vietnam is lost, and Watergate happens, so there's a cynicism about politics in general.
Go on.
Yeah, and then you look at things where you've got Pinter's No Man's Land, which is talking about playwrights who have passed their time and are wondering what's coming next.
I'm not sure that everyone had that amount of self-awareness. And actually, I think that The one person who did and has continually wrestled with that is Pete Townsend.
I agree.
And I think that Pete was always, part of his raison d'etre for The Who was not just to make it, not just to have a group which smashed against all of those things which everyone else was smashing against at the time, the establishment, but also as an art movement, as a kind of art event. And I think he continually wrestled with the idea of what on earth should a 26, 28, 32, 38-year-old rock star, how can he have an effect or be an operationally instructive rock star because you're too old. And I think that's interesting. But I think a lot of people just had careers.
But I think that not only
that they didn't worry about how much they were connecting with people, which is why punk had to happen, because they weren't interested. They were just interested in their own identity and their own careers.
Can I give you a quote here? Sorry, Gary. I just want to give you a quote because it's so true. On The Who by Numbers, where he's already written The Punk of the Godfather 2 years before. But there's a line which is, "Why, all you punks, stay young and stay high. Hand me my checkbook and I'll crawl off to die."
Yeah, exactly.
In 75.
But one of the things that's happening is the lyrics are stopping being about us, and
about
them,
me.
and about me. And even on that Who by Numbers album, it's about him, isn't it? It's about him.
This is Pete Mark II. This is the album when he started writing that way, which he will then write from now on. Which is this is just me, flawed, and
Is that a cultural thing?
Yeah, I think it is, and it's an age thing. And actually, I think it's become. I mean, and if you look at the lyrics on, the lyrics on Siren are not so different from the lyrics that would have been on any Roxy album, because they were about Ferry's journey through the kind of slipstreams of society and his own romantic escapades, regardless of how much that was a persona. But I think if you look at the lyrics on Young Americans, most of them, they are very, very personal. And also, I think that one of the reasons is, as you discussed, that generally these artists are talking about themselves as opposed to lots of people, but also in a kind of anti-generational. But also, it's that suited the genre. Because a lot of great soul music, unless it's antagonistic, is about the self. It's about relationships. It's about me and you. And I think that came across very, very, very strongly. I mean, there's another word which is why I think this period for years was demonized, because these people were thinking of themselves as artists. And punk was obviously about, fuck you, you're not an artist. But this is what they were striving for. And obviously it went through a period where to strive to be an artist was meant to be a negative, because it was insular, it was inward looking. But that's what they were trying to do. I mean, particularly on something like Hissing of Summer Lawns. And I think that, Joni Mitchell displayed lots of negative traits the older and more successful she became. But I think that's probably the pinnacle of what she was trying to do as an artist.
Yeah, because she's looking out. But this all the stuff you're touching on here, because it is the me decade now, isn't it? And remember, there's Est. There's all that stuff, EST. And London was full of Rajneesh. It was full of middle-class people all dressed in orange. Wasn't it? There was all that going on.
Yeah, people wanted to. That's true. And it's like, it's like the very end of Mad Men. It's like, how can I get to a deeper sense of me?
One of the bands that seems to sort of represent 75 most of all to me is Fleetwood Mac. And of course, you talk about that Fleetwood Mac album where they first meet Buckingham Nicks. And she's even on the front cover of the book, isn't she?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's Fleetwood Mac at the time were complete anathema to me. I didn't understand them, didn't like them.
Peter Green Albatross, wasn't it, for us?
Yeah, it was.
That's what
weird
the re-release
stuff. And again, that's post-rationalization about the success of an old blues band who'd reinvented themselves in North America and became this behemoth. So I
But
hope
none more me.
Sorry?
None more me, or everything was just about them, wasn't it?
But also the fact, do we not think it's interesting that you've got this young duo, Buckingham Nicks, who are happy to let their identity become completely subsumed by this bunch of old, it would have been ancient to them, if you think about in that time frame.
And I think it's so strange now, and I hope there's enough objectivity in the book to reinforce this, but I think it's extraordinary that a lot of the people that we revere in terms of popular culture from that time are things which at the time lots of people really didn't like. I mean, I didn't love ABBA, I didn't love Fleetwood Mac, but now they're the kind of mainstay of Friday night hen party enjoyment. I mean, it's I think the whole cult of Fleetwood Mac is absolutely extraordinary. But yet, it was 75 where they started scaling the peak.
Do you think that music would have kept? Is it? Are you saying that music would have kept on developing,
No,
become a greater art form, but punk came along and sort of infantilized everything?
but it needed to. And actually, I think that even those people who paid scant attention to punk carried on regardless, blithely, and they weren't creating masterpieces. I talked earlier about Joni Mitchell. I mean, the records she made after that were less good. And the records that Bob Dylan made were less good.
Not punk's fault.
Roxy Music, etc. The only one who didn't was Bowie.
But then, although the interesting thing is, because I remember going to America in 1978, Freddie Laker, and I went to LA, because if you want to see what would happen if punk hadn't happened, you just go to America, because it didn't. It kind of didn't. It's, tons of things like, but in America, that's what you get. And the only stuff that really, really lasted is the stuff that worked with punk, which is like Springsteen.
Yeah. Well, again, Springsteen is someone who now I revere and is extraordinary. But even then, I didn't really understand Springsteen until I went to America, and I drove across America in a big car, and I looked at the sky in Texas and went, I get it now. Because it doesn't mean anything.
Robert Elms got it, didn't he? Robert Elms was there in those early gigs during, when Born to Run first came.
He saw
to England.
He saw the 75 tour, and I have to say I don't have many regrets in my life, but I do regret not seeing that, because that must have been extraordinary. And also, I think that one of the things that a lot of the rock press didn't really understand about Springsteen at the time was that he did have these genuine R&B roots. And a lot of the live stuff from that period, which we've heard afterwards, they were a massive R&B band. They managed to fuse it with this widescreen idea of American
Jersey Shore.
Yeah, no, it was a sound that you thought you knew, but you didn't. It didn't exist. It sounded like the thing. Because I've got to say, sorry, I'm just going to say that Born to Run was absolutely seismic for me from day one. And even in my first ever band, which was like a mod revival band, I used to wear a Born to Run t-shirt under my suit.
But there was a sense of the punk, wasn't there, in Springsteen, and we all saw that film on the Old Grey Whistle Test of what he
straight jeans. He wore straight jeans. He will leave, old fashioned.
Yeah, and you can make the connection into Elvis Costello and into
because it was New
Joe
York.
Strummer.
I think New York now is a completely uninteresting prospect, but back then it was still enticing, and there were still enough rough edges. Yeah, and the fact that two years later, Bruce Springsteen is making records with Patti Smith, that's interesting. But you're right, he still had the kind of blue collar, blue jean, meeting across the river vibe. Again, it's very intoxicating to teenagers who are obsessed with the urban.
If I think of 75 in England, though, apart from Siren and Young American, I'm really thinking pub rock and double denim and a sort of, an attempt at Americana. And I suppose you're looking more to America as as their great cultural moment. Do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, but for me, I loved pop rock, and I saw most of those groups. But for me, I was more interested in the Dr. Feelgood end of it than the kind of
Castle Flyers.
well, the kind of idea that they were folkies who couldn't make it on a big stage. They were playing in pubs because there was
Bearded Lady.
Hmm?
Bearded Lady.
No, you can't. You have to stop as soon as you mention pub rock. Then you just start playing pub rock bingo, don't you? It's just like,
Yeah.
But I like the R&B aspect of it, and
Band called
again,
O.
I mean,
Sorry.
the Dr. Feelgood concert for me was as important and as seismic as all the punk gigs I saw. They were just amazing. I mean, it was just, and I still can't believe I was only 14 when I saw them, because I thought I was at least a year older. But anyway,
it's
And
funny.
if you Sorry, go on, Guy.
You go. No, because it was just a little. I say it's funny you say that, because it's been fantastic having to concentrate on that and go back and look at stuff, because there's an awful lot of stuff like records that I thought was 75 are actually 76. It's funny there is a kind of shift, songs in the key of life, for instance. I thought,
well, I was desperate to write about that, but I couldn't because it's the wrong year.
No, exactly, yeah.
How do you? Because you write a lot of. You've written so many books about pop culture and about particular people like Bowie and Live Aid and New Romantics. How do you approach your work, Dylan? Talk us through the stages of creating something like this.
Well, for this, it was a one subject book. And recently I've tried to do like a one subject book, and then followed by a book that involves a lot of interviews. I mean, I've done 4 oral biographies, and I'm doing my next one now, which is about restaurant culture, which is about London restaurant culture, from Langan's Brasserie up until now. And that will involve me interviewing at least 120 people. And I usually interview about 100 people for those kind of books. And then I like doing single issue books. Like I did a book on the song Wichita Lineman, and I've got an idea for what I'd like the book after that to be. So, yeah, I suppose I'm lucky enough to be able to largely pick subjects that I want to write about and then get people to publish them. Although the restaurant book is actually a book that I'm writing because I couldn't get my agent interested in the book that I actually initially wanted to write. But I will get there.
I know it's about me, isn't it? Anyway. But how good? Just talk us through a day of a writer. Are you very disciplined?
I don't subscribe to this idea. I mean, I read these things and people say, yeah, I like to get up and go for a walk and prepare. And then I'm really happy if I do 500 words a day. And then I go for a lie down and, blah, blah. I can write anywhere. I can write on a bus. I can write in the back of a cab. I can write in bed. I mean, I write all the time, and I find it really easy to, because I think it's a craft. I was dyslexic. I didn't have a very good education. I didn't start reading till I was a teenager. So I'm a complete autodidact. So it's a craft. I've learned it, and I think most people can. And it broke my heart when the BlackBerry went out of business, because I wrote an entire 7,000 word piece on Tony Bennett coming back from New York once, having interviewed him for Men of the Year. And I mean, yeah, so I'm the opposite of that kind of person. My old agent, Ed Victor, dearly departed.
Yeah.
Ed,
The legend.
Oh, he was such a close friend of mine, and he said that he used to have two kinds of clients. One, they'd finish a book and then go off and climb the Himalayas and come back 5 years later and start writing another one. Another client, which would be, you finish a book, you have a Diet Coke, and you start again. And I'm very much the latter.
It's because of where you came from, Dylan, like with ID and everything before that. And your writing has always been very driven by culture, hasn't it? And
yeah.
Is it the need to kind of document the culture and the world around you that you're experiencing that drives the writing, or is it, would you just be writing about something else?
No, I think it's all about culture. And when we were ID in the early 80s, and there is a certain amount of arrogance attached to it, but it's more to do with the period. We knew that when we were writing about all the stuff that was happening in London, where it was nightclubs, it was fashion, it was publishing, people becoming video directors, what have you. That we knew that we were as much a part of that world as well as cataloguing it, and it was exactly the same as the face, and that gives you a certain amount of arrogance, and it also meant that we felt that we could determine the culture as well as write about it, because for us it was an iteration of Swinging London. It was the third iteration of Swinging London, so that empowered us, and I think that my approach to culture has been the same ever since.
50 years later, what do you think? You may not want to even bother with this question, but just what is the summation of where pop culture is now?
Well, I think I would answer that in two ways. I think that on the one hand, you can look at the post-war period, which in some respects is coming to an end because that generation of people are dying. And I think that you can look at the three most important people from that world, that generation, Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, and Pete Townsend, are still with us. And it's a terrible thing to acknowledge, but in 10 years' time, they may not be. And that, you could say, is the end of that period. And with that comes an understanding that that is probably the richest period, I would say, in British culture. It's certainly in British pop culture. It's so rich. And also now we have the ability to delve even deeper into that period where every photograph becomes of interest, every demo tape becomes of interest, every sketch for a painting, every first draft for a book, all of these things become of enormous interest. Plus, we're also moving into a period where, particularly if the government have their way, that we're signing away our rights and allowing anyone to come in and skim everything. And I do think that's very important. And at the Standard, we wrote a lot about this. And I think it's disappointing that the government is only really taking interest now that people like Elton and Paul McCartney are getting involved because they love meeting celebrities. But I do fear that the creative industries are going to be sold down the river. And I think the idea that tech companies can come along and skim everything that I've done, everything that you guys have done, in order to use that as R&D for projects which they'll make money off, I think is outrageous. However, that notwithstanding, I'm not one of these people who says my pop music was better than your pop music. And I hope, and I know that in dark corners of London somewhere, there will be very young people breaking stuff, which is what the culture needs to go forward.
Here. There's a
favourite album of 75?
Sorry?
Is there a favourite album that you have of 1975?
Of course.
Go on.
I'm disappointed you even have to ask.
Blood on the Tracks, isn't it?
It's Young Americans.
You said the best album of 1975 is Blood on the Tracks in the book.
No, I don't.
You did.
Guy, can you also tell Gary that my next book is not about him? Much as he'd like it to be. It's my dog.
I'm reminded of Oscar Wilde's famous quote, which was, "I spent all morning putting a comma in and all afternoon taking it out." So you've missed your comma insertion this morning by talking to us.
I'll get it done this afternoon.
There's actually a couple of things I'd quickly like to mention before I go. I knew nothing of Street Life magazine before.
Oh, right.
No, nor did I.
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing.
Tell us about that.
What I mean, as I say in the book, I do have all of them. But I think it's interesting because you take a 5-year shift to 1980, and the constituent parts of the face are not that different from Street Life. But the thing is, the face worked because the face was cool, and also it was edgier, and also the face was aimed at someone who felt younger. They were probably aimed at exactly the same person in exactly the same demographic. But I think that person in 1980, post-punk, felt a lot younger than the equivalent person would have done in 1975. Because in 1975, we all wanted to be older, and in 1980, we wanted to be younger.
But that person in 1975 was one of them, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was the PC.
That's the kind of great cult that never really gets talked about, isn't it?
Logan world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the sort of pre-punk thing.
It's true. It's very, very true.
Yeah, and the book made me want to walk into the Zanzibar, which I never went to because I was too young.
God!
It was on the same street as the Blitz Club.
I love the Zanzibar.
I love the Zanzibar. I remember I was only a couple of times when I was very young getting taken there. Yeah.
Did you go, Dylan?
I did, yeah. And I was in the Zanzibar with Peter York, and we were leaving, and Peter'd bump into some people from an ad agency he knew, and he said, Peter was asked this question. He said, "Do you think the Groucho is going to make the Zanzibar obsolete?" As a metaphor for London, that was a huge question.
But wasn't there the great story of Keith Allen was in the Zanzibar and he smashed the bar up one night and he ended up going to jail for it. And Tony Mac said to him, "I'm really sorry about that, but if I start another club, you'll have free membership for life." And that's why he's unbannable from the Groucho.
Yeah, I'm trying to get that story into my book on restaurants, but I know that I'm going to have legal issues down the line.
Can I actually?
Dylan,
I just want to mention one other thing. And I'm sorry.
Let's
Gary.
not finish.
No, I just want to mention that because, and I've never mentioned this before, and I've never brought him up on the show, but it just seems relevant. That in 1975, my dad was in a play at the Royal Court Theatre by Sam Shepard called The Tooth of Crime, where he played this old rock and roller or this big Mick Jagger type rock star, and Richard O'Brien played this young upstart who was going to come and knock him off his throne.
Wow.
Exactly what was about to happen in the world.
About Sam Shepard, and I'm reminded of the Rolling Thunder tour that came out of Blood on the Tracks.
Rolling Thunder Review.
Sam Shepard Rolling Thunder Review, which Sam Shepard wrote the sort of diary of. You know, he went on tour with him, didn't he?
Yeah, and that is a great book. But I have to say, I remember being incredibly disappointed with the Martin Scorsese thing. In fact, I just had I had a knee operation, and I had told to like stay at home for a week, which with me was awful. And so
he did a documentary.
I was watching this documentary and thinking, God, this is really interesting. And then I read afterwards, it's all made up.
It's all bollocks, yeah.
It's all made up.
It's all bollocks.
I mean, it's stupid. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
we are in the business of, being archival about our extraordinary past. Then someone just comes along and makes something up. I say, who likes fiction? Come on.
Exactly. It's Marty, come on.
It's funny, there were two things that drew me to Dylan as a kid, and both of them came from glam rock. One was Hard Rain's Gonna Fall when Ferry covered it.
Yeah.
So I went and listened to the original. And the other was because Mick Ronson ended up playing on that Rolling Thunder.
That's still weird, isn't it? The fact that Ronno ended up with Bob Dylan is just mad.
Yeah.
Absolutely mad.
So thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Dylan. That's so nice to have you.
That was so great. That was one of the most stimulating chats.
Right.
Obviously,
it's great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed, guys.
We won't reveal where you are, and we know you're in the witness protection after this book.
What of it?